There are two general battery types, down-tube mount and rear rack assembly. A down-tube battery is installed on the bottle cage mounts located on the down tube of a frame. The benefit of this version is a lower center of gravity and a more natural distribution of weight. A rear rack type system is more versatile and fits on atypical and low entry frames. This type of system includes a proprietary BionX rear rack that can be used for bags and cargo, and an integrated rear light. BionX offers a variety of batteries in either the down tube or rear rack type with a different capacity and range. 48-volt BionX batteries have a function called deep sleep mode to preserve battery energy over periods of inactivity. If a 48-volt battery does not turn on, it may be in deep sleep mode. Plug in the power supply to AC mains and the touch port to wake up the battery. Before installing a down tube battery, the frame and bottle cage mount position must be checked to ensure the battery fits. Use the templates in your dealer manual, also found on ridebionx.com, if you don't have the specific battery and harness handy. When installing the harness, a piece of tape can be used to protect the frame from paint damage. Fold an end over to allow easy removal of excess tape when finished. The down tube battery can be mounted in several positions via the 4 different sets of holes in the harness. Always attempt to use the button head screws and the 2 rear flat holes first. These best clear the plate on the underside of the battery. Tighten the button head screws with a 3mm Allen key until snug, and then 1/2 turn. As you tighten down the harness for the first time, get low and look closely at the gap between the rail and the frame. If you see the rail bend, the battery will not slide smoothly and it will be difficult to install and remove. It is not necessary to heavily torque the screws. The recommended torque is 4 Nm or 36 inch-pounds. Test the battery installation and removal by placing it on the rail and sliding upwards until you feel the plate engage with a knock, approximately 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch from the harness receptacle. Gently slide the battery forward and guide the release arm until it is closed. The battery will be flush with the receptacle on the harness. Never force a battery into place. If force is required, revise the harness install. Always check that the battery sits firmly in place and does not wobble significantly side to side. A critical step when installing the down tube harness is to apply thread locking compound to ensure the screws don't come loose due to road vibration. Failure to use thread locking compound may allow the screws to loosen over time and cause interference with the battery plate. This may impede removal of the battery. To finish, reinstall the battery fully in the harness and hold down the release arm. Push in the lock cylinder until you hear a click and the battery is locked in place. To remove a down tube battery, turn the key clockwise while pressing on the release arm and the lock cylinder will pop out. Use the release arm to slide the battery upward and lift to remove. If necessary to negotiate interference of the seat post tube or top tube, use the countersunk screws and paired countersunk holes on the harness. These are 64 mm apart to align with the bottle cage mounts on most bicycle frames. Tighten them using a Phillips screwdriver. Attention must be paid that the countersunk screws are absolutely flush with the harness rail to clear the battery plate. If this is neglected, the screw heads will cause interference with the battery plate and not permit removal of the battery. Pay attention, this can occur the very first time it slides into place. Large flat washers can be added under the harness as required to prevent rail deformation for tapered down tube designs. Ensure that the countersunk screw heads are flush every time that they are adjusted, and make sure that the battery doesn't wobble. Use thread locking compound on these screws as well to keep them from coming loose due to road vibration. The rear rack battery includes a rack which is installed as any other rear-mounted bicycle rack. There will be 4 points of contact for the rear rack, 2 on the seat stay where the rods attach, and 2 on the frame dropouts where the ladder is attached. The rod assembly is as follows: bolt, support, spacer, rod. It is best to assemble these over a bench. You will need a 4mm Allen key. Install the rod cap now so the rod doesn't slide off easily while mounting the rack. The ladder is assembled on the inside of the rack legs using the 3mm Allen head bolt and the nut provided. This requires an 8mm wrench. You will have to use the hardware from the bicycle to install the rack. Start with the ladder on the dropout mounts and follow with the rods and seat stay mounts. Adjust the rods and ladder with the bicycle on the ground so the rack is as close to the rear tire as possible and still level with the ground. The power and communication cables route inside the gutter on the left-hand side of the rack. If necessary, secure the DC output to clear the tire with a zip tie. To install a rear rack battery on the rack, place it on the rail approximately 2.5 centimeters or 1 inch from the connector. Gently push forwards on a rear rack battery. Note that you should not push on the integrated light, push on the handle to insert it. Never force a battery into place. Push in the lock cylinder until you hear a click and the battery is locked in place. On a rear rack battery, don't force the lock cylinder if it doesn't push in easily. Make sure the battery is inserted all the way into the receptacle and try again. To remove a rear rack battery, turn the key clockwise and the lock cylinder will pop out. Then remove the key and use the handle on the tail end of the battery to slide it from the harness. Use your thumbs to pry the battery out so there is less risk of dropping it. Inspect the battery DB7 connection visually by ensuring that the connectors align and that they are straight. Make sure the battery is inserted all the way by checking the position of the battery case compared to the harness receptacle. Make sure the DB7 is clean and not corroded over time. Some dielectric or silicone-based grease is applied here directly from the factory and can be reapplied as necessary. Never plug or unplug any part of the system with the system turned on, including the battery. If the battery is removed with the system turned on, allow 5 minutes for the battery to turn itself off. You will hear 5 beeps signaling the battery turning off. The motor cable should be routed as discreetly as possible, between the right side of the frame and the crankset, down through the frame between the stays in front of the rear wheel, and along the underside of the chainstay on the non-drive side of the frame. Never connect or disconnect any system cable or part with the system turned on, especially the motor power cable. Note that if this is pulled with the system turned on, turn it off before reinstalling. Connect the motor power cable tightly, then the motor communication cable. Note, always proceed in this order. The communication cable has an arrow on the female side and a small white triangle on the male side of the connector. These must be aligned before attempting to close the connection, or damage will occur to the connector pins. These close with a click. Spinning these connectors while attempting to close the connection will cause the pins to bend or break. Use the large neoprene cover to keep water and debris clear of the connections, and use the smaller neoprene cover to keep the shorter motor cables secure but easily unplugged in case of a flat. With these covers, there is no need to add cable ties on the motor side of the connected cables. Work backwards from the motor to hide any cable slack. Loose cable is more easily concealed under the bottom bracket. A rear rack system comes with a single longer neoprene cover for the connectors. Make sure these cables clear the tire and disc rotor, and secure the cables on the harness side of the connections with cable ties. Note, be sure there is no tension on either side of the connectors that will cause them to pull loose over time. A longer communication cable is provided, be it the type which is directly wired to a down tube harness or the type with a secondary connector on the rear rack battery harness. Route the communication cable along the underside of the down tube of the bicycle frame. Make sure the harness cables are clear of all bare brake or gear cables and the crankset so they are not damaged over time. You can use the cable guides and ties that are provided in the accessory bag for a clean install. The communication cable plugs into the console dock. Note that the communication cable has an arrow on the female side and a small white triangle on the male side of the connector. These close with a click. A rear rack system has another communication connection on the harness to be installed in the same manner.